It was supposed to be a routine day, calm, predictable, like any other in Orchard Pine Estates. The sun was out, birds were chirping, and the sound of sprinklers could be heard faintly in the distance, keeping the neighborhood's perfect lawns watered. You know the type of place. Neat, pristine, where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. People here didn't have much to complain about, just the usual suburban issues. Did the mailbox look right? Was the lawn mowed just the right amount? But on that morning, in the quiet streets of Orchard Pine Estates, the peaceful facade would be ripped apart in the most horrifying way. The crackle of a taser shattered the calm, slicing through the air, a sound so out of place in a neighborhood known for its tranquility. It wasn't the sound of a dog barking or a distant lawnmower. It was the unmistakable sound of a life being interrupted, of a system designed to protect being twisted into something deadly. Meredith Evans had no idea that when she raced her ambulance down those same familiar streets, she would find herself fighting not just to save a life, but fighting against the very rules that were meant to protect people. The call had come in. Jeanette Williams, 76, struggling with heart problems, slipping into cardiac arrest. Time was everything. When Meredith and her partner Kyle arrived, there was no time to lose. They jumped out of the ambulance, immediately grabbing their gear, ready to rush to the house. But as they ran up the perfectly manicured driveway, they were stopped dead in their tracks. A security guard, Brad Morton, stepped in front of them, blocking the path. He wasn't concerned about Jeanette's health. He wasn't looking at the paramedics' uniforms or the ambulance parked right behind them. Instead, Brad pointed at them and demanded they follow the rules. He said they needed clearance. For a second, Meredith thought she might be misunderstanding. She held up her EMS badge and pointed to her paramedic patch. She gestured toward the ambulance, trying to signal that they were there to save a life. But Brad's face remained hard as stone. He wasn't impressed by her uniform. He wasn't about to make an exception for a heart attack. The guard, a man who probably never had to make a life or death decision in his life, kept repeating the same line: no entry without clearance. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Jeanette was dying, and all this man cared about was following protocol. Meredith knew she had to do something. She shouted at him, telling him there wasn't time for this nonsense. This wasn't about a form or a pass. This was about a woman's life. But Brad just stood there, unmoved, stubborn. He barked orders to call his supervisor. The seconds dragged on. Kyle, the driver, was inside the ambulance, already on the phone with the watch commander, asking for permission to enter. Meanwhile, Meredith was caught in a nightmare, standing face to face with a guard who was more interested in gate codes than the woman who was dying just a few feet away. She could hear Jeanette's last breaths in her mind, each one a desperate gasp for air. "Call your supervisor," Brad growled, his voice rising with aggression. "I don't care what your badge says. No one gets in without my say-so." Meredith's voice shook as she snapped back. "I'm a supervisor too." She pointed to her badge again, but before she could even take another step, she saw it, the taser. Brad pulled it from his belt with alarming speed. He aimed it directly at her torso and pressed the trigger. The electrical current ripped through her like a storm. It was so intense that she could feel her whole body lock up. The pain was unbearable. Meredith fell to the ground, her vision swimming as she gasped for air. She couldn't believe it. The man who was supposed to be securing the neighborhood had just stopped a paramedic in the middle of saving a life. She was lying on the grass, helpless, as the seconds ticked by. Every moment, every second of this delay had been another death sentence for Jeanette. She could only hope that Kyle would somehow break through and get to her in time, but Meredith knew in her gut that it was already too late. The woman she had come to save had already slipped away. And sure enough, by the time paramedics were finally allowed in, it was over. Jeanette was gone, Her heart had stopped beating. The county medical examiner arrived, but there was nothing left to do. She was pronounced dead at the scene, just moments after Meredith had been struck by that electric jolt. The tragedy was almost too much to comprehend. In Orchard Pine Estates, people were used to disputes over mailbox colors and holiday decorations. Not this. This wasn't just an issue of a paramedic being delayed. It was a death that never should have happened. The neighbors were shocked, but the questions started coming fast. How could this happen in a place like Orchard Pine Estates, where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest crime might have been a missing lawn ornament? How could a paramedic be denied access to an emergency? Why was a guard like Brad Morton given so much power in the first place? As word spread about Jeanette's death, the outcry grew louder. It wasn't just a small group of people who were angry. It was the whole community. People had questions, and they wanted answers. They couldn't believe what had happened, and they wanted to make sure that no one else would be subjected to the same fate. This was no longer just a tragedy. It was a public outrage. The HOA, the board that had set up these security measures, was suddenly under the microscope. How could they have allowed this to happen? They had prioritized security over everything else, to the point where a life had been lost. Brad Morton, the guard who had tasered Meredith, claimed he was just following orders, that the rules had to be followed at all costs. But to the residents, it didn't matter what rules Brad had been following. What mattered was that a woman had died, and someone had to be held accountable. The HOA was facing an enormous backlash. It didn't take long before lawyers and attorneys started knocking on doors, offering their services to Gary Williams, Jeanette's widowed husband. A wrongful death lawsuit was filed against the entire HOA board. It was a lawsuit that no one saw coming. The community, once so focused on their lawn care and seasonal decorations, was now gripped by a feeling of unease. What had once been a peaceful haven was now a place where neighbors exchanged nervous glances, where people whispered in driveways and wondered if they could trust the HOA anymore. And for the board, the nightmare was just beginning. The damage had already been done. They had let this happen. No amount of PR damage control could reverse the tragedy that had unfolded. For them, it was no longer about HOA rules and regulations. It was about something much bigger, the loss of a life and the anger of an entire community. The board would soon find out that their tightly controlled, rules-first world had just crumbled, and it wasn't just a paramedic they'd hurt, it was their whole neighborhood. And in the days that followed, everyone in Orchard Pine Estates would have to come to terms with the fact that the very thing they had trusted to keep them safe, their security system, had now led to a tragedy. And it was a tragedy that none of them could undo. The moment Gary Williams, Jeanette's husband, made the decision to sue, it set off a chain of events that would shake Orchard Pine Estates to its core. It wasn't just a lawsuit about a delayed ambulance anymore. It was about accountability, justice, and the protection of basic human life. The community, which had been idyllic in its appearance, was now forced to confront the truth. The security protocols they had once relied on had failed them in the worst possible way. People had always trusted the HOA to keep them safe, to handle any disruptions, to make sure the community ran smoothly. But now, in the wake of Jeanette's death, the board members could no longer hide behind their glossy brochures and well-groomed lawns. They were under siege. Gary wasn't just angry, he was determined. Determined to make sure that no one else would ever have to suffer because of the rigid rules that had caused his wife's death. As the lawsuit progressed, the pressure mounted. The HOA board could no longer ignore the inevitable questions that were now being asked at every turn. How could they justify the use of such extreme security measures in a community that had never faced any real threat? How could they explain the fact that a paramedic, someone who had dedicated her life to saving others, was treated like a criminal trying to break into the neighborhood? Behind closed doors, the board of directors started to fracture. Some wanted to settle quickly, throw money at the situation, and hope it would go away. Others insisted they had done nothing wrong. They argued that their protocols were necessary for the safety of the community, that they had simply been protecting the homeowners from potential threats. But no matter how they tried to frame it, the truth was undeniable. Jeanette Williams had died because of the very rules they had put in place. The realization hit them hard. It wasn't just about a single guard. It was about a culture that had been created over the years, one where security had become more important than common sense or human compassion. The policies that were supposed to protect had instead become a wall, blocking out the very thing the HOA was meant to safeguard: people's lives. The community began to take sides. Some residents, who had always been in favor of the strict security measures, defended the board, arguing that safety was paramount. But as the details of the lawsuit came out, more and more people began to realize the truth. The HOA's obsession with security had created a situation where even first responders, people who were there to save lives, could be turned away at the gate. The whispers in driveways grew louder. People began to question everything they had been told about safety, about the HOA's authority, and about the priorities that had guided the community for so long. Was security really the highest value, or had they lost sight of what really mattered? Gary Williams wasn't about to let this go quietly. The deeper he dug into the HOA's policies, the more he found. He began to piece together how these draconian security measures had come to be, how the board's obsession with rules had led to an environment where no one, not even a paramedic, was above suspicion. The HOA's defense was clear. They had merely been following procedures. They had just been doing their job. But to Gary, it was simple. His wife was dead because the people who should have been protecting her had chosen rules over reason, security over life. And so, the lawsuit continued to build, not just as a fight for justice for his wife, but as a battle to hold the HOA board accountable for a system that had turned deadly. The legal proceedings were intense, with attorneys poring over every document, every decision the board had made. The stakes were high. If Gary succeeded, the board members could face personal liability, fines, and even the destruction of their carefully constructed reputation. But even if they lost, they would be left to pick up the pieces of a shattered community, one where trust had been replaced by suspicion, and safety had been replaced by fear. As the case moved forward, Meredith Evans, the paramedic who had been tasered, was drawn deeper into the fight. She too was determined to make sure that what had happened to her, and to Jeanette, would never happen again. It wasn't just the physical pain of the taser that haunted her. It was the fact that she had been stopped in the middle of trying to save a life. For years, she had rushed to emergencies, driven by the knowledge that every second counted, that the difference between life and death could be a heartbeat. But now, she was forced to relive the moment when her hands had been tied by an overzealous guard. The emotional toll was just as devastating as the physical injuries. Meredith had always been proud of her work, proud of the difference she made every day. But now she felt humiliated. The reality of what had happened to her on that suburban lawn was something she couldn't shake. Her once unshakable confidence had been replaced by doubt. She was now on light duty at the EMS station, still recovering from the shock, both physically and emotionally. But she knew she couldn't stay sidelined forever. She wanted to get back to doing what she loved. She wanted to prove to herself that she was still the paramedic she had always been. But the memories of that moment, of being tasered while trying to save Jeanette, lingered. Still, Meredith knew that the fight wasn't over. The board had to be held accountable, and she was going to be a part of that fight. As the trial date approached, the town was buzzing with anticipation. Orchard Pine Estates, once a picture-perfect community, was now divided. People who had never questioned the HOA before were now speaking out, sharing their frustrations about the growing sense of fear and control that had taken over the neighborhood. In public, many residents tried to maintain a calm, orderly facade. But behind closed doors, the whispers were growing louder. Residents were starting to organize, to demand changes in the HOA's policies. They wanted to know why they had been living in a place where fear had become the dominant force, where the priority had shifted from helping others to keeping everyone out. The outrage reached a boiling point when it became clear that this wasn't just a local issue. It was a matter that was going to affect the entire community, and possibly the future of the neighborhood itself. As the trial went on, the evidence started to pile up. Meredith took the stand and described what had happened that day. She talked about how she had been blocked from entering the neighborhood, how she had shown her badge and tried to explain the emergency, but how Brad Morton had refused to listen. She spoke about the taser, the shock, and the pain. The courtroom fell silent as Meredith recounted her struggle to save Jeanette, only to be stopped by a man who was more focused on following rules than understanding the situation. The defense tried to argue that Brad had simply followed procedure, but it was clear that the board's policies had failed in this instance. The board members tried to distance themselves from Brad's actions, insisting they had never authorized the use of force against emergency responders. But the truth was, they had created the environment that led to that moment. They had prioritized safety at the expense of common sense. And in the end, it cost Jeanette Williams her life. The community, once proud of its security measures, was now forced to confront the ugly truth about what those measures had really cost them. The board could no longer hide behind their rules. They were facing a crisis, one that was bigger than anything they had ever imagined, and the weight of their decisions was about to come crashing down on them. As the trial progressed, the tension in Orchard Pine Estates continued to escalate. The once perfect community, where neighbors rarely disagreed, now found itself caught in the middle of a battle for justice and accountability. The HOA board, which had once been seen as a respected authority, was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own actions. The residents, many of whom had trusted the board's leadership, were now speaking out. Their frustrations were growing as they realized the extent to which their community had been transformed into a fortress, where the safety and well-being of people had become secondary to rigid rules and an overbearing security presence. Behind closed doors, the board members tried to maintain their composure, but cracks were starting to show. The weight of the lawsuit was becoming unbearable, and some board members were beginning to feel the pressure of personal responsibility. They had to make decisions, hard decisions. But no matter which way they turned, they couldn't escape the fact that Jeanette Williams's death had been directly tied to the policies they had put in place. Alan Connolly, the president of the HOA, found himself at the center of the storm. He had always been a man of conviction, someone who believed in the necessity of strict boundaries and security. After all, his own experience with a violent mugging had left him with a deep mistrust of strangers, a fear that had shaped his view of the world. He had always been the one to push for stronger security, for more protection, for more rules that would ensure the safety of the residents. But now, in the face of the lawsuit and the growing public outrage, those same rules were being questioned. Alan had spent years building the community into what it was, and yet, in a matter of weeks, it was falling apart. He tried to reassure the other board members, telling them that they would handle this, and that the board had done nothing wrong. But even he was starting to question whether the steps they had taken had been too extreme. What if they had gone too far? What if their obsession with safety had led to something irreversible? The depositions continued, each one more uncomfortable than the last. The pressure on the board was mounting as more evidence came to light. Rebecca Stokes, Gary Williams' attorney, was relentless. She carefully deconstructed the HOA's defense, poking holes in their claims and demanding accountability. She turned the spotlight on Alan, asking him about the security policies he had helped create. Alan's defense was always the same. They were just trying to protect the community. But Rebecca wasn't having it. She pushed him, asking him how, in a community that prided itself on its strict protocols, they could have allowed a paramedic, someone trained to save lives, to be treated like a criminal, blocked at the gates, and tasered by a security guard who was just following orders. She pressed him on the specifics, the details of the security measures the HOA had implemented. She asked how, in a world where emergency services are supposed to have free access, could the HOA's policies be so rigid, so inflexible, that they could result in a death? Alan's defense was weak. He tried to argue that it was an isolated incident, that the guard had overstepped his bounds, but Rebecca hammered home one point over and over again. This wasn't just one guard's failure. This was the result of a larger problem, a problem created by the HOA's rules and policies. The residents watching from the sidelines were becoming more and more vocal. Some had always been in favor of the HOA's strict rules, believing they were necessary for their safety. But now, as they saw the board struggle to justify their decisions, the cracks began to show. The fear that had once been the foundation of the community was now being questioned. Residents began to ask themselves if the HOA had gone too far, if their obsession with control had led them to create an environment where safety was no longer about people. It was about control. In the wake of Jeanette's death, the question had shifted. What had happened to the community they once loved? Was it possible to live in a place where safety didn't come at the cost of humanity? As the trial moved forward, the jury heard from more witnesses. Kyle, Meredith's partner, took the stand, and his testimony was devastating. He described the chaos of the situation, the confusion, and the panic that had set in when they were stopped by Brad Morton. He recounted the moment when he was inside the ambulance, on the phone with the watch commander, trying to get permission to enter, all the while knowing that every second was critical. When he finally ran back to the front yard, Meredith was already on the ground, electrocuted by the taser. Kyle's voice shook as he described how, in those brief moments, everything had gone wrong. The seconds that should have been spent helping Jeanette had instead been wasted. The jury could see it now. The picture of a system gone wrong, a system that had placed rules above life, a system that had failed in the most tragic way. As the defense tried to distance the board from the incident, the truth became clearer and clearer. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. This was a tragedy that had been made possible by the environment the HOA had created. The board had put in place policies that made it harder, not easier, for people to get the help they needed. And now, those policies were coming back to haunt them. The jury was listening. And with each passing moment, the weight of the board's decisions was becoming harder to ignore. The final blow came when the jury delivered its verdict. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the foreperson stood to read the decision. When the words were finally spoken, they were like a hammer coming down. The jury had found in favor of Gary Williams. They had ruled that the Orchard Pine Estates HOA was responsible for Jeanette's death. The board members had failed to create a system that balanced security with common sense, and that failure had cost someone their life. The financial ramifications were immediate and severe. The HOA was ordered to pay a substantial settlement, one that would undoubtedly send the board members scrambling. It wasn't just about money, though. The board had lost something far more important: their reputation, their authority, and their control over the community. The residents, who had long trusted the board to protect them, now saw the truth. They had been living in a system that was more concerned with rules than with people, and the cost of that system was now crystal clear. Orchard Pine Estates would never be the same again. The sense of security that had once defined the community had been shattered, and the board, once so powerful, was now on the defensive, facing a future that was uncertain at best and disastrous at worst. The board members were stunned. They had thought that they could control the narrative, that they could hide behind their policies and their security measures, but the jury's verdict had proven them wrong. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about the lives that those rules had affected. The residents who had once been content to let the board handle everything were now questioning everything. The victory for Gary Williams and Meredith Evans wasn't just a legal win, it was a societal wake-up call. The community of Orchard Pine Estates, so steeped in fear and control, was now forced to reckon with the reality of what had happened. And the board members had to face the consequences of their decisions. The legal storm they had created wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the final gavel came down, the members of the HOA knew that their world, the world they had worked so hard to build, was on the verge of collapse. The aftermath of the verdict was swift and unforgiving. Orchard Pine Estates, once a bastion of security and well-kept lawns, now found itself at the heart of a scandal that had rocked the community to its core. The board members, still reeling from the blow of the jury's decision, found themselves scrambling to maintain what little authority they had left. They had hoped that a quick resolution or a private settlement would put an end to the public outcry. But now, with the full weight of their failure on display, there was no turning back. The community's faith in the HOA had been shattered, and no amount of damage control could restore the image they had once enjoyed. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the reputation of the board, the safety of the residents, and the very foundation of what had made Orchard Pine Estates so perfect. For the first time in years, residents who had once been content to live quietly behind the gates began to openly question the very system that had governed their lives. The tension was palpable, and the undercurrent of unease was impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had never considered challenging the HOA now found themselves at the forefront of discussions about reform. The very policies that had been put in place to create a safe environment were now being criticized as draconian and oppressive. The idea that a paramedic, someone who was supposed to be trusted to save lives, could be stopped and tasered by a guard enforcing those rules left a bitter taste in the mouths of many. The once cordial gatherings at neighborhood events were now filled with whispers of dissatisfaction. People were organizing, sharing their frustrations, and talking about the changes they wanted to see in the future. Even the residents who had once supported the board, believing that the HOA's security measures were a necessary evil, were starting to question if the balance had been lost. Meanwhile, Gary Williams, the widower who had fought so relentlessly for justice, found himself in a position he never imagined. His grief was still raw, the pain of losing Jeanette never far from his mind. But now, with the victory in court, he knew his fight wasn't over. He had lost his wife, but his fight was about ensuring that no other family would ever experience the same loss, the same senseless tragedy. He had said from the beginning that he wasn't looking for a payout or for fame. He was looking for accountability, for change. And now, with the lawsuit successful, the attention was on him and on Orchard Pine Estates. The media were camped outside his house, eager for a soundbite, a quote, anything that would allow them to tell the story of the grieving husband who had taken on a powerful HOA and won. But Gary wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or a poster child for a cause. He just wanted the board to answer for what they had done. And as the public scrutiny intensified, it became clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community as a whole. It was about making sure that the culture of control and fear that had taken root in Orchard Pine Estates was dismantled, so that nothing like this could ever happen again. The board, on the other hand, was facing its own reckoning. The members had hoped that the verdict would be the end of it, that they could move on, lick their wounds, and return to running the community with their strict security policies. But that wasn't going to happen. The financial consequences of the lawsuit were devastating. The HOA was now responsible for paying a significant settlement, one that would drain their reserves and leave them scrambling to cover the costs. Worse, the insurance policies that had once covered these kinds of issues were no longer a safety net. The public outcry was so intense that it threatened to bring down the entire HOA. The members of the board were not only facing financial ruin, but also the possibility of being forced out of their positions. The reputation of Orchard Pine Estates, once a beacon of suburban perfection, was in tatters. The guards they had hired, the security systems they had put in place, the very policies they had championed, had led to a death, and now those policies were under intense scrutiny. The cracks in their once impenetrable fortress were growing larger by the day. Behind the closed doors of the clubhouse, the board members held emergency meetings. There was no longer any debate about the impact of Jeanette's death. They had seen the consequences unfold in the courtroom, and now they had to decide what to do next. Some members wanted to double down, to fight the changes and continue defending the policies they had put in place. They argued that if the security protocols were relaxed, it would open the floodgates to danger, to crime, to unwanted intrusions. They believed that what had happened with Jeanette was a tragic accident, but not something that should alter the core structure of the community. Others, however, saw the writing on the wall. They knew the policies had gone too far. The culture of fear they had cultivated had not only caused harm, but had alienated the very people they had vowed to protect. The idea of defending these policies any longer seemed impossible. The board was divided, unsure of how to proceed in a way that would allow them to salvage their positions while also appeasing the residents who were calling for change. But as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Orchard Pine Estates could never return to what it once was. The system that had been built, the one based on control and security, was being torn down from the inside out. Residents began to speak out more vocally, demanding that the board either make real changes or step down entirely. A petition circulated, demanding the immediate resignation of the entire board. It was signed by dozens of residents, many of whom had once been complacent, trusting in the HOA to handle everything. But now, they had seen the consequences of those decisions, and they wanted change. The petition spread like wildfire, reaching even the most reluctant residents who had quietly tolerated the rules for years. The demands were clear: fire the security company, dismantle the excessive security measures, and return the community to its roots, one where neighbors looked out for each other, not where strangers were treated as threats. In a final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage, Alan Connolly, the HOA president, tried to meet with Gary Williams. He drove to Gary's home, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. He had hoped to settle the matter quietly, to offer some compensation for the pain Gary had endured. Maybe, just maybe, they could avoid a complete collapse of the HOA by agreeing to some changes and a financial settlement. But when he arrived, Gary's grief had hardened into something else. He was no longer the grieving widower. He was a man with a singular goal: justice. Alan, in his desperate attempt to save face, offered Gary a settlement. He suggested compensation, an apology, and even some changes in policy, things that might soften the blow. But Gary was unmoved. He had lost his wife. A check wouldn't bring her back. The changes he wanted were far more significant. He demanded that the entire board be dissolved, that the security company be fired, and that new guidelines be put in place, ones that would protect the residents without creating an atmosphere of fear. Alan, who had spent years defending these policies, found himself cornered. He knew that the board would never agree to Gary's demands, but Gary's words struck deep. If you truly want to help, you need to start over. You need to dismantle what you've built. Alan had no answers. His fortress of rules had crumbled, and all he could offer was a weak defense. Gary's response was simple: "Then there's nothing more to say. I'll see you in court." As the legal proceedings continued, the residents of Orchard Pine Estates found themselves more united than ever before. The community that had once been divided over trivial matters, like the color of their mailboxes or the height of their hedges, now came together with a shared purpose. They wanted change. They wanted a community that prioritized people, not rules. And as the court date approached, the weight of the past few months hung heavily over the board. The decision they had made all those years ago, the decision to prioritize security over everything else, had led to the death of a resident and the destruction of their carefully curated world. The verdict was inevitable. The community had already spoken. The board would be held accountable, and change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. For Gary, it was bittersweet. He had fought for justice, for accountability. But in the end, the only thing that could ease his pain was knowing that Jeanette's death had sparked the change needed to protect others. For Meredith, the paramedic, it was a step toward healing. She had been injured physically, yes, but the emotional toll was just as severe. The taser's shock had shaken her belief in the system she had always trusted. Yet, with the lawsuit's success, she could take comfort in the fact that her own fight had contributed to something bigger. The changes that came in the aftermath of this tragedy would reverberate throughout Orchard Pine Estates for years to come. And in the end, the community learned a hard lesson. Rules without compassion, safety without trust, were not the answer. What they needed was a balance that recognized the value of every life, no matter the situation. And that lesson would never be forgotten.